For decades, some of the most disturbing crimes in history remained buried in dusty police files, unanswered and almost forgotten. Families waited year after year, hoping for a miracle, while killers lived freely, believing time had erased their guilt. But time does not destroy the truth, it only hides it. With the rise of modern DNA technology, digital databases, and determined investigators, many silent cases finally began to speak again. In today's story, we will explore 10 cold cases that were finally solved after decades of silence, proving that justice may be slow, but it never truly disappears. In the 1970s and 1980s, California was terrorized by a mysterious criminal later known as the Golden State Killer. He attacked dozens of women and murdered at least 13 people before vanishing without a trace. For more than 40 years, police had no suspect and the victims' families believed the killer would never be found. In 2018, investigators uploaded old crime scene DNA to a public genealogy website, hoping for a miracle. Within weeks, the DNA led them to a former police officer named Joseph Dangelo. At the age of 72, he was arrested and finally confessed, ending one of the longest manhunts in American history. In 1986, 20-year-old Michelle McGrath was found murdered in Chicago. The evidence was weak, witnesses were silent, and the case quickly went cold. Her family waited more than 3 decades with no answers, only questions and pain. In 2018, detectives reopened the file and tested preserved evidence using modern DNA techniques. The results matched a man already serving time for another crime. After 32 years of silence, Michelle's killer was finally identified, proving that even the smallest piece of old evidence can still reveal the truth. 8-year-old April Tinsley disappeared while walking home from school in Indiana in 1988. Her body was later discovered, but her killer remained unknown. For 30 years, the case haunted the town, and parents feared the monster might still be nearby. In 2018, police tested DNA taken from a letter the killer had once sent to authorities. That single test changed everything. The DNA led to John D. Miller, a quiet man who had lived in the same community all along. He confessed to the crime, and after 3 long decades, April's family finally received justice. 17-year-old Carla Walker was kidnapped and murdered in Texas in 1974. At the time, investigators had very little to work with, and the trail quickly went cold. Her family never stopped hoping, even as 45 years passed. In 2019, forensic experts used advanced DNA testing on preserved evidence from the crime scene. The results identified Glenn McCurley, a man who had once been questioned but never arrested. After nearly half a century, Carla's killer was finally exposed, showing that justice can arrive even after a lifetime of waiting. Between 1985 and 2007, a serial killer known as the Grim Sleeper murdered multiple women in Los Angeles. For years, police had DNA but no name. The killer blended into the community, living a normal life while families mourned their loved ones. In 2010, investigators used genealogy databases to trace the DNA to a suspect named Lonnie Franklin Jr. He was arrested near his own home and later convicted. After more than 25 years of terror, one of Los Angeles' most feared predators was finally brought to justice. In England, Helen Gale was brutally murdered in 1984. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, and no suspect. For 35 years, the case remained frozen in time. Then, in 2019, scientists tested old blood samples using modern DNA profiling. The results pointed to a man who had already died years earlier. Although he never faced trial, the truth finally came out and Helen's family at last learned who had taken her life. Even death could not hide the killer's secret forever. The murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessup in Canada in 1984 led to one of the most tragic miscarriages of justice in history. An innocent man, Guy Paul Morin, was wrongly convicted and spent years fighting to prove his innocence. Later, DNA evidence cleared his name, but the real killer was still unknown. In 2020, investigators finally matched preserved biological evidence to the true murderer. 35 years after Christine's death, justice was restored and the terrible mistake was finally corrected. Janet Ringe was killed in California in 1986, and for 30 years her case remained unsolved. Detectives reopened the investigation in 2016 and sent old DNA samples for advanced testing. The results identified a suspect who had lived freely for decades, believing he had escaped punishment. He was arrested at the age of 72. After 3 decades of silence, Janet's family finally heard the words they had been waiting for. The killer had been found. In 1957, the body of a young boy was discovered in a box in Philadelphia. No one knew his name, his family, or how he had died. For 64 years, he was known only as the boy in the box. In 2022, genetic genealogy finally identified him as Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Although his killer remains unknown, the child finally received his identity, and the world remembered him not as a mystery, but as a real boy who deserved justice. In 1971, Rita Curran was murdered in Vermont, and her killer vanished without a trace. For more than 50 years, the case remained unsolved. Then, in 2023, police tested old evidence using genealogy databases and identified the murderer, a man who had died years earlier. Even though he could never be arrested, Rita's family finally learned the truth after half a century of uncertainty. These stories remind us that time may silence witnesses and hide evidence, but it can never erase the truth. With modern technology and determined investigators, even the coldest cases can be brought back to life. Justice may arrive late, but when it does, it brings closure, answers, and a powerful message to every criminal who believes they have escaped. No secret stays buried forever. Another haunting case that remained silent for decades was the murder of Mary Shotwell Little in 1965. Mary disappeared from a shopping center in Georgia after an evening with friends. At first, police believed she had simply run away, but her burned car was later found, proving something terrible had happened. For more than 50 years, the case stayed cold with no suspect. In 2018, investigators reviewed old witness statements and evidence, finally identifying a former coworker as the main suspect. Although he had already died, the truth about Mary's fate finally came out, giving her family long-awaited answers after more than half a century. In 1979, college student Deborah Jackson was found murdered in Texas. With no identification and no missing person report, she was buried under the name Orange Socks, based only on what she was wearing when discovered. For 40 years, no one knew who she was or who had killed her. In 2019, advanced DNA testing finally revealed her identity. She was Deborah Sue Jackson, a young woman who had run away from home years earlier. Although her killer was already dead, Deborah finally got her name back, and her family finally learned what had happened to her. The case of Patricia Otto in Wisconsin shocked investigators when it was reopened after 30 years. Patricia disappeared in 1992, and for decades there were no leads. Her family believed she had simply vanished forever. In 2021, police tested DNA found on old evidence and matched it to a former coworker. He confessed to killing her and hiding her body. After nearly 3 decades of silence, Patricia's remains were recovered, and her family finally had a place to mourn her properly. In 1981, the brutal murder of Carol Ryan in Ohio left police with no suspect and no answers. Years later, investigators used genealogy databases to trace DNA found at the scene. The killer turned out to be a man who had lived quietly in another state for years, believing his crime had been forgotten. In 2022, he was arrested and charged. More than 40 years after Carol's death, her family finally saw justice begin to take shape. One of the most emotional cold case resolutions involved the disappearance of Susan Cox Powell. Although her case was widely known, her body was never found and her husband died before trial. Years later, new forensic analysis confirmed details that proved his guilt beyond any doubt. While her remains remain missing, investigators were finally able to close the case officially, giving Susan's parents peace after years of painful uncertainty. In 1968, the murder of Gloria Robertson in New Jersey shocked the community. The killer left behind very little evidence, and the case slowly faded into history. In 2020, detectives used new DNA testing on preserved samples and identified the suspect, a man who had lived just miles away for decades. He was arrested at the age of 80. After 52 years, Gloria's family finally learned the truth about who had destroyed their loved one's life. Another remarkable breakthrough came in the case of the Lady of the Dunes, an unidentified woman found murdered in Massachusetts in 1974. For nearly 50 years, no one knew her name or her story. In 2022, genetic genealogy identified her as Ruth Marie Terry, a woman whose family had been searching for her for decades. Her husband soon became the main suspect. Although the investigation continues, Ruth finally got her identity back, and her story was no longer lost to time. These cases show us something deeply powerful, that silence does not mean the end. Files may close, Detectives may retire and witnesses may disappear, but truth waits patiently. Every drop of blood, every strand of hair, every forgotten letter holds a story that can one day speak again. Families who never gave up are finally rewarded with answers, even if those answers come many years too late. In today's world, technology has become the strongest weapon against forgotten crimes. DNA databases, genetic genealogy, and modern forensic science are opening doors that were once locked forever. Killers who once felt safe are now being found in their old age, sometimes arrested in front of neighbors who never suspected a thing. The past is no longer silent, it is speaking louder than ever before. And so, as we look back at these 10 cold cases finally solved after decades of silence, one truth becomes clear. Justice does not forget. Time does not protect the guilty. And no matter how long it takes, the truth always finds a way to come out of the darkness and into the light.